It didn't begin with a public decree, but with a closed-door meeting at Clarence House that no one was supposed to know about. Senior aides entered tense and exited shaken. Within hours, royal schedules shifted, calls were made, and one name quietly disappeared from briefing notes: Edward. Something had shifted inside the monarchy's inner circle, and this time, the silence was louder than any scandal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed that meeting did not unfold in headlines or official statements. It moved quietly, almost surgically, through the hidden mechanisms of the monarchy, those invisible channels where decisions are not announced but felt. Reports suggest that inside Clarence House, the atmosphere had already been tense for days, with palace administrative streams ranging from treasury whispers to security log adjustments hinting that something significant was under review. King Charles III, already navigating the physical toll of illness since early 2024, was said to be unusually focused during this particular briefing, surrounded not just by senior advisors, but by legal counsel, whose presence alone signaled that this was no routine discussion of public engagements or ceremonial duties. And then came the shift, subtle at first. Prince Edward, long regarded as the quiet sentinel of the institution, the man who had spent over 3 decades operating in the background with precision and loyalty, was suddenly absent from conversations where his presence had once been automatic. Insiders whisper that briefing documents, those meticulously prepared files that dictate the rhythm of royal life, began to arrive without his name attached. It wasn't announced. It wasn't explained. It was simply done. A quiet excision, executed with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that defines the old guard of the House of Windsor. Within hours, palace staff were reportedly instructed to recalibrate upcoming engagements. The word itself, clinical, detached, masked the deeper implications. Engagements were not merely rescheduled, they were reassigned. Roles shifted. Appearances reconsidered. Those familiar with the Duchy of Cornwall's rigorous standards would recognize this pattern instantly. When the system recalibrates, it is not reacting, it is enforcing. And this enforcement came with an unusual tightening of internal communications protocols. Emails were restricted, calls rerouted. Access to certain internal briefings quietly limited. It was, as one insider reportedly described, a containment operation, not a correction. But containment of what? That question began to ripple through media circles almost immediately. Journalists like Robert Hardman and Ingrid Seward have long noted that when the palace moves in silence, it is often because the issue at hand is too sensitive to risk public interpretation. And this time, the whispers carried a name that had, until now, been synonymous with discretion and stability: Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Early murmurs suggested a connection unclear, undefined, but impossible to ignore. Not a scandal in the traditional sense, but something more complex. Something that required not public defense, but internal containment. Those closest to the situation reportedly struggled to reconcile the image they knew with the implications now being discussed behind closed doors. Sophie had, for years, been viewed as a stabilizing force, a figure who operated within the boundaries of protocol while quietly expanding her influence. To see her name even indirectly linked to a situation that warranted this level of response was, by all accounts, deeply unsettling. And yet, the machinery of the monarchy does not pause for disbelief. It moves forward, guided not by emotion, but by doctrine, by the unspoken understanding that the institution must always come before the individual. By the end of that day, the message, though never spoken aloud, was unmistakable. Something had been triggered. Something that required immediate action, precise execution, and above all, absolute silence. The removal of Edward from key discussions was not a miscommunication. It was not a temporary oversight. It was a deliberate act, one that suggested the existence of a deeper issue, one that could not yet be revealed, but could no longer be ignored. And as the palace tightened its grip on information, as schedules shifted and names disappeared, one truth began to emerge with chilling clarity. This was not about optics. This was about control. But Edward's sudden exclusion wasn't a standalone decision, it was the consequence of something far more explosive quietly surfacing behind palace walls. For decades, they were the monarchy's safest pair, the quiet workers, the dependable faces, the ones who never made headlines. Edward and Sophie weren't just loyal, they were essential. which is why what came next wasn't just surprising, it was unthinkable. Because in a royal family often defined by spectacle, scandal, and shifting allegiances, Prince Edward had built something far more powerful: silence. Not absence, but presence without disruption. Insiders had long referred to him, in careful and measured terms, as the quiet sentinel, a figure who understood the machinery of the monarchy not as a stage, but as a system. For over 30 years he operated within it with almost surgical precision, never overstepping, never drawing unnecessary attention, and yet always there when stability was required. He wasn't the headline. He was what allowed the headlines to exist without chaos. And in a monarchy increasingly tested by internal fractures, that kind of reliability became invaluable. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, mirrored that same discipline but with a different kind of influence. Where Edward represented continuity, Sophie embodied trust, particularly in the years following the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Her role quietly expanded in ways that were never formally announced but widely understood within royal circles. Reports suggest she became a confidant not just in ceremonial matters, but in the subtle, often unseen dynamics that hold the institution together. She was, as some insiders whispered, one of the few who could move between generations, respected by the old guard, trusted by the new. And in a family where trust is currency, that placed her in a uniquely powerful position. Their rise, however, was not born out of ambition, it was born out of absence. The departure of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from royal duties created a vacuum that could not remain unfilled. The monarchy, already navigating public scrutiny and internal recalibration, needed figures who could step forward without bringing additional controversy. Edward and Sophie did exactly that. They didn't demand attention, they absorbed responsibility. Engagements increased. Appearances multiplied. Their presence became more visible, not because they sought it, but because the institution required it. And in that evolving structure, their alignment with Prince William became increasingly significant. William, as the future of the monarchy, was said to be shaping what many described as a new working monarchy: leaner, more controlled, more focused on duty than tradition for tradition's sake. Edward and Sophie fit seamlessly into that vision. They understood restraint. They respected hierarchy. They operated within the boundaries that others had tested or abandoned. Together, they formed a quiet but effective extension of that future, a bridge between legacy and transition. Public perception followed naturally. In a time when the monarchy's image was under constant pressure, Edward and Sophie became symbols of stability. No controversy, no unpredictability, just consistent, measured service. They were in many ways the embodiment of what the institution wanted to project: discretion, loyalty, and above all, reliability. And as King Charles III faced the physical and emotional strain of illness, that reliability became not just valuable, but necessary. Their roles expanded again, this time not gradually, but decisively. More responsibility, greater visibility, deeper involvement in the inner workings of the crown. But here is where the tension begins to surface, because in a system built on control, proximity to power is never neutral. The closer one moves to the center, the greater the scrutiny, the higher the stakes, and the thinner the margin for error. And while Edward and Sophie appeared to navigate this space with the same quiet precision that had defined their careers, whispers suggest that not everything was as seamless as it seemed. That beneath the surface of loyalty and discipline, there were complexities, unseen pressures, undisclosed dynamics, and perhaps decisions that had yet to come into full view. Because the very qualities that made them indispensable, trust, access, influence, also made any potential misstep far more consequential. And in a monarchy that does not forgive easily, where even the perception of deviation can trigger institutional response, the idea that something might have been overlooked, or worse, concealed, was enough to shift the entire narrative. What had once been seen as their greatest strength, their ability to operate quietly, now raised an unsettling question. Had something been operating quietly for too long? That image of quiet reliability made what surfaced next all the more destabilizing because it suggested something had been hidden in plain sight. It wasn't a leak, it wasn't a tabloid rumor. It was a document circulated quietly among senior officials that reportedly forced the palace to act. And at the center of it all was Sophie. The shift from quiet suspicion to controlled urgency happened almost overnight. though insiders suggest the groundwork had been building for weeks, if not months. What made this different, what made it impossible to dismiss, was the nature of the information itself. This was not hearsay, not speculation. It was, according to various interpretations from palace administrative streams, a structured disclosure. Something reviewed, cataloged, and passed through channels that are typically reserved for matters of institutional consequence. The kind of material that doesn't just raise questions but demands answers. At the heart of it, reports suggest, was what has been described in hushed terms as a sensitive disclosure tied to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. The exact contents remain tightly contained, but those familiar with the situation whisper about private affiliations and advisory connections that may not have been fully visible within official frameworks. Not necessarily improper, but possibly incomplete. And inside a monarchy where transparency is tightly managed and perception is everything, even the suggestion of undisclosed influence becomes a problem that cannot be ignored. Because in this world, it's not just about what is done, it's about what is known, what is recorded, and what is declared. And if something exists outside of that structure, even unintentionally, it creates a fracture. A small one at first, almost invisible. But under pressure, those fractures expand. They raise questions. Who knew? When did they know? And more importantly, why wasn't it addressed sooner? The timing only intensified the concern. The monarchy was already operating under heightened scrutiny, with King Charles III managing both personal health challenges and the broader demands of a modernizing institution. Every decision, every association, every public and private action carried amplified weight. There was no margin for ambiguity. And yet, here was a situation that, by its very nature, introduced uncertainty into a system that depends on control. Sources close to the inner workings of the palace suggest that legal advisors were brought in almost immediately, not to react publicly, but to assess quietly, to review implications, to map out potential consequences. Because this wasn't simply about Sophie as an individual. It was about what her position represented. A trusted figure. A bridge between generations. Someone who had been allowed proximity to the very core of the institution. And if there were gaps, if something had existed outside the expected parameters, it raised a far more uncomfortable question. Was this an oversight or something more deliberate? That question, according to insiders, became the center of an internal debate that was as tense as it was unavoidable. Some interpretations pointed toward a failure of process, a situation where evolving roles and expanding responsibilities had outpaced the systems designed to monitor them. Others, more cautious but no less concerned, wondered whether the lines had blurred in ways that were never formally acknowledged, not an act of defiance, but perhaps a quiet assumption that certain boundaries did not need to be revisited. And this is where the real danger began to take shape, not in the specifics of the disclosure, but in its potential impact. Because the monarchy does not operate in isolation. It exists in the public eye, sustained by trust, reinforced by consistency. And anything that threatens that perception even indirectly becomes a risk to the crown itself. The idea that there could be undisclosed elements within the inner circle, however benign they might seem in isolation, introduced a narrative the institution could not afford to let grow unchecked. The concern was no longer contained within a single document or a single name. It had expanded into something broader, something structural. A question of accountability, of oversight, of whether the systems in place were still strong enough to manage the complexities of a changing monarchy. And as those questions moved through the highest levels of decision-making, one reality became impossible to avoid. This was no longer just an internal matter. It was a test of leadership, of judgment, of how far the crown was willing to go to protect itself not from external threats, but from the possibility of internal vulnerability. And for King Charles, already carrying the weight of expectation and the pressure of legacy, the path forward was narrowing with every passing moment. Because in a monarchy built on continuity, hesitation is not neutral, it is risk. What began as internal concern quickly escalated into a constitutional dilemma, forcing King Charles into a decision he could no longer delay. King Charles had spent years balancing loyalty with duty, but this time, the scales tipped. Faced with mounting pressure and a monarchy already under strain, he made a decision that insiders describe as cold, necessary, and irreversible. Because by the time the document had been reviewed, analyzed, and quietly circulated among the highest levels of royal authority, there was no longer the luxury of delay. Reports suggest that King Charles III was briefed repeatedly, not in a single meeting, but through a series of controlled discussions that unfolded over several days, each one adding weight, each one narrowing the range of acceptable outcomes. This was not simply about information, it was about implication. About what the existence of that information meant for the institution he now carried on his shoulders. And those familiar with the internal dynamics of the monarchy understand this well. When something reaches the king in this manner, it is no longer a question of if action will be taken, but how severe that action must be. The pressure did not come from one direction. It came from all sides, converging with a quiet intensity that left little room for compromise. Senior royals, particularly those aligned with the preservation of institutional discipline, are said to have voiced concerns not publicly, not even directly, but through the kind of structured counsel that carries unmistakable weight. Figures like Prince William, already preparing for the future of the crown, were reportedly focused on long-term credibility. Others, including the ever-resolute Princess Anne, are believed to have emphasized the importance of precedent, that what is allowed once becomes harder to challenge again. And behind them all stood the silent influence of legacy itself, shaped by the enduring expectations set during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, whose approach to duty left little tolerance for ambiguity. But beyond internal counsel, there was something even more pressing: public trust. The monarchy, in its modern form, survives not just on tradition, but on perception. It is sustained by the belief that those within it operate under a clear and unwavering code. And any suggestion, however nuanced, that this code had been tested or bypassed created a vulnerability that could not be ignored. Charles understood this better than anyone. He had spent decades preparing for a role that demanded both empathy and enforcement. But now, faced with a situation that blurred the line between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility, he was being asked to choose not as a brother, not as a father, but as the sovereign. And that choice came with a cost. Because removing Prince Edward from active royal duties was not just a procedural adjustment, it was a statement. A signal that no position, no matter how quietly earned or faithfully upheld, existed beyond the reach of accountability. Internally, the move was carefully framed as a temporary restructuring, a phrase designed to soften the impact while maintaining operational control. But those within the system understood the deeper meaning. Temporary measures, in the language of the monarchy, often carry a permanence that is never formally declared. They are not reversed easily. Sometimes they are not reversed at all. For Charles, the emotional weight of this decision cannot be overstated. Already weakened by illness, already navigating the physical and mental demands of a reign that began under intense scrutiny, he now faced a moment that required not strength, but resolve. Reports suggest that those closest to him observed a shift not in authority, but in demeanor. A quiet heaviness. The kind that comes when duty demands something personal be set aside. Because this was not just about Edward's role. It was about their shared history. Their place within a family that had always been both united and divided by the same unyielding force, the crown. And yet, the decision was made. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of finality that defines the monarchy at its core. Edward's removal was executed through the same mechanisms that had elevated him: formal channels, internal directives, and above all, silence. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. And in that absence, a message that resonated far beyond the immediate situation. The institution had acted. It had drawn a line, and it had done so without hesitation. But decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They ripple outward, touching every corner of the structure they were meant to protect. Relationships shift. Alliances tighten. Questions emerge, some spoken, others carefully withheld. And as the reality of Edward's removal began to settle within the inner circle, it became clear that this was not the end of the matter. It was the beginning of something else, something larger, something that would test not just the individuals involved, but the very framework of the monarchy itself. But removing Edward wasn't just about control, it triggered a ripple effect that would reshape the monarchy's inner circle. The aftermath wasn't loud, it was precise. Invitations changed. Meetings were rescheduled, access quietly revoked. Inside royal corridors, the message was unmistakable. Something had shifted, and not everyone would recover from it. At first, the changes seemed almost administrative subtle, enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, but deliberate enough that those within the system recognized their significance instantly. Prince Edward's absence from key events was not explained, yet it was impossible to ignore. Engagements where his presence had long been expected, those carefully curated moments that reinforce continuity, were suddenly proceeding without him. Briefings that once bore his name were redistributed. Committees he had quietly supported for years moved forward under different guidance. It was not a dramatic removal. It was something far more controlled, a systematic withdrawal that spoke volumes without saying a word. And alongside that absence came another shift, equally quiet but no less telling. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose schedule had once reflected her rising influence, began to fade from the public rhythm of royal life. Appearances were postponed. Commitments quietly reassigned. Where there had once been consistency, there was now unpredictability. Reports suggest that even internally, her access to certain discussions had been recalibrated, not removed entirely, but adjusted in ways that signaled caution. The same discretion that had defined her ascent now seemed to be shaping her retreat. Within the inner circle, reactions were measured but unmistakable. Prince William, already positioned as the future of the monarchy, is said to have responded with a focus on continuity, ensuring that the transition, however abrupt, did not disrupt the broader structure he is expected to inherit. His approach, according to those familiar with his leadership style, was not emotional but strategic. Stability had to be maintained. The system had to keep moving, and if that required difficult adjustments, they would be made without hesitation. But it was Princess Anne who reportedly embodied the institution's response most clearly. Known for her iron-willed commitment to duty, Anne has long been seen as the enforcer of royal discipline, the figure who ensures that tradition is not just respected, but upheld. Insiders whisper that her role in this period was not to question the decision, but to reinforce it, to ensure that the boundaries being redrawn were understood, respected, and, if necessary, defended. Because in moments like this, the monarchy does not rely on sentiment, it relies on structure. That structure, however, was undergoing a quiet but undeniable realignment. Responsibilities once shared were redistributed. Roles were reassessed. The delicate balance that had existed among senior royals was being recalibrated in real time. And while the changes were executed with precision, they did not go unnoticed by those who operate behind the scenes. Staff, accustomed to the steady rhythm of royal operations, found themselves navigating uncertainty. Instructions shifted, priorities changed, and in the absence of clear public communication, internal morale became increasingly fragile. Because uncertainty, even when controlled, has a way of spreading. Beyond the palace walls, the silence only fueled speculation. Media outlets, long attuned to the subtle signals of royal life, began to piece together the fragments. The absence of Edward, the reduced visibility of Sophie, the timing, so closely aligned with reports of internal review. Journalists like Ingrid Seward and Robert Hardman have often noted that when the palace chooses not to speak, it is rarely because there is nothing to say. And this time, the silence felt heavier than usual, less like discretion, more like containment. Speculation intensified, not because of what was known, but because of what was missing. No statements, no clarifications, just a series of coordinated adjustments that, taken together, painted a picture of an institution responding to something it could not yet fully reveal. And as that picture became clearer, so too did the implications. This was not a temporary disruption. It was a recalibration of power, influence, and trust within. One of the most carefully managed institutions in the world. Yet beneath the procedural fallout lay a deeper question: what does this mean for the monarchy's future structure? In moments of instability, the monarchy doesn't fracture, it consolidates. And as Edward stepped back, others stepped forward, forming what insiders describe as a tighter, more controlled inner circle. What followed was not chaos, but calculation. The kind of deliberate restructuring that doesn't announce itself, yet reshapes everything beneath the surface. With Prince Edward removed from the immediate framework of decision-making, attention shifted quietly but unmistakably toward Prince William. Already positioned as the future of the crown, William's role did not simply expand, it sharpened. Reports suggest that his involvement in key discussions became more direct, more frequent, and more influential, signaling a transition that had perhaps been anticipated but not expected to accelerate under such circumstances. This was no longer preparation, it was participation. And with that shift came a renewed emphasis on structure, on defining not just who holds responsibility, but how that responsibility is exercised. William, long associated with a vision of a streamlined monarchy, appeared to move with quiet decisiveness. The idea of a working royal model, leaner, more focused, less ceremonial, and more accountable, began to take clearer shape, not through declarations, but through action. Fewer voices in the room, fewer roles overlapping, a tighter circle operating with precision rather than breadth. Alongside him stood Princess Anne, whose influence in moments like these becomes both visible and essential. Known for her uncompromising approach to duty, Anne has long been regarded as the internal compass of the institution, the figure who ensures that tradition is not diluted by convenience. Insiders whisper that her presence during this period was not just advisory, but directive. Where uncertainty existed, she enforced clarity. Where boundaries blurred, she redrew them. Because for Anne, the monarchy is not a flexible entity, it is a structure that survives only through discipline. Together, their alignment created something more than stability, it created control. A quiet reinforcement of hierarchy that reminded everyone within the system of its fundamental principle. The crown is not shared equally. It is organized, ordered, and when necessary, recalibrated. This recalibration extended beyond individuals to the very rhythm of royal operations. Responsibilities were redistributed with care. Engagements reassigned with purpose. The system, though tested, began to settle into a new configuration, one that prioritized loyalty, transparency, and above all, accountability. Because if there was one lesson drawn from the unfolding situation, it was this: proximity to power must be matched by clarity of role. No ambiguity, no assumptions. Every position defined, every responsibility understood. And while this may have appeared, from the outside, as a natural evolution, those within the institution recognized it for what it truly was: a response. A controlled adjustment designed to prevent uncertainty from taking root again. Efforts to stabilize public perception followed naturally, though never overtly. The monarchy does not rush to explain itself. It reassures through consistency. Appearances continued. Engagements proceeded. The outward image remained composed, even as the internal structure shifted beneath it. This is how the institution protects itself, not by denying change, but by managing how that change is seen. And in doing so, it reinforces a message that has defined it for generations. The crown endures, regardless of who stands closest to it. Yet even within this renewed sense of order, there was an awareness, unspoken, but deeply felt, that something had been altered, not broken, but changed. The inner circle was smaller now, tighter, more deliberate. And while that brought stability, it also introduced a new dynamic, one where every role carried greater weight and every decision left a deeper mark. Because consolidation, while necessary, is never without consequence. It strengthens the structure, but it also reveals its limits. It clarifies authority, but it also isolates those who fall outside its boundaries. And as the monarchy moved forward, steadier but more controlled, one truth remained quietly present beneath the surface. The institution may have regained its balance, but the cost of that balance had not yet fully revealed itself. But even as the institution steadied itself, the personal cost of these decisions lingered behind palace doors. Beyond the headlines and protocol shifts, there were relationships strained, tested, and possibly fractured. Because inside the monarchy, duty may come first, but it never comes without a price. What unfolded behind closed doors was not captured in official statements or carefully managed appearances, but in something far more difficult to contain: silence between people who had once operated in quiet understanding. Reports suggest that the relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward, long defined by mutual respect and shared experience, began to feel the weight of what had been decided. Not through confrontation, but through distance. Conversations that once flowed easily became measured. Interactions, when they occurred, carried an unspoken awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Because when duty intervenes at this level, it does not just alter roles, it alters trust. For Edward, the transition was not simply professional. It was deeply personal. After decades of service defined by consistency and restraint, to find himself repositioned quietly, without explanation, introduced a kind of isolation that few outside the institution can fully understand. The monarchy, by its nature, does not provide space for public grievance. There are no statements of defense, no opportunities for clarity.